They called it a courtesy audit and made it sound like a favor. A quiet mission near the dam after closing, with a temporary pass that would let me cross doors I usually waited outside. I said I preferred daylight and a second set of hands. And the voice on the line replied that daylight complicated security and hands multiplied rumors. The email that followed had the kind of clipped courtesy I recognize from agencies that live on signatures. My name in the right place, a brief scope, a promise of cooperation from site staff, and a non-disclosure line that made the air feel thinner. I stared at the dam's outline on the map, a wide back pressed against the river's insistence, and reminded myself that my job was simple. Water tells the truth if you ask it the right way. A storm had rinsed the hills earlier that day and left a clean chill in the trees. I parked below the visitor lot and walked the service path so my headlamp wouldn't draw curious eyes. The pass waited in a small envelope under the guard shack, just as promised, taped to a memo that did not carry a name. I slid the badge onto a lanyard, pressed the plastic until it gave that small creak that means it's going to hold, and put on my hard hat even though I was still outside. Ritual matters. The sealed notebook rode in the inside pocket of my jacket because I wanted the paper warm when it met ink. The thermal camera, battery topped up, sat snug in a side pouch where I could find it without looking. The flow meter, my stubborn friend with its scuffed vane, hung from my pack strap like a tool that knows it will be used. Inside the operations corridor, the lights kept a careful distance from one another, making islands of yellow that left the corners to their own thoughts. I checked in with the night engineer at a counter where a pot of coffee had gone bitter and a stack of safety brochures leaned toward collapse. He didn't ask many questions, which told me the memo had gone further than the tape. Scope, he said, and I kept it plain. Inlet head, tailrace turbulence, cross-check logs and sensors, confirm no anomalies in discharge or temperature. He slid a binder across the counter with the last week's summaries and a longer ledger with historical baselines. His pen tapped a page that held an hourly graph, and he said, "We reset after a power blink. Records will look crooked. Power blinks happen. Crooked records happen. My job is to uncrooked them if I can." I started at the upstream catwalk. The reservoir lay dark and steady, except for a low pulse near the intake, where wind pushed a faint chop toward concrete. I set the flow meter in the water at a known angle and let it settle until its vane found a rhythm. The sound, a small hum tucked inside river noise, matched what my hands expected through the handle. I counted breaths and marked a qualitative velocity, then shifted to a shallower edge where eddies tend to lie about speed. The numbers I might have written stayed in my head as words. Faster here than there, honest at mid-channel, a touch slow close to the intake booms. Beneath the catwalk, the structure muttered in that way big structures do when the load is steady and the world is not. I breathed with it until the mutter became background, and then moved on. At the tailrace platform, I uncased the thermal camera and took a sweep of the outflow. Heat signatures climb and fall in patterns as steady as tides when the plant is healthy. Tonight, the main plume looked normal, a smooth tongue fading as cold river took it apart, but along the far wall I saw a narrow ribbon of warmth that didn't belong to any gate I knew. I logged it as a note to prove or disprove later and took a second sweep to confirm it wasn't my hand or the lens acting up. Same ribbon, same shy glow like a secret. I closed the camera and let the metal cool against the rail until it stopped carrying my skin's heat back to me. When I turned, the night engineer stood a respectful distance down the platform, not close enough to crowd me, not far enough to be casual. "You good?" he asked. I said I was and asked about recent work orders. He shrugged, the kind of shrug that speaks of schedules and budgets. "Nothing outside routine." He looked at the river longer than the question required. From the platform I took the service corridor toward the auxiliary intake. The pass chirped at each door with a practiced indifference. The corridor air carried a smell that didn't fit the season. Wet cedar, as if lumber had been stacked inside and left to think about rain. Concrete should smell like dust, oil, and old water. Cedar means a crate, a temporary repair, or something that came in a hurry. I ran a hand along the wall, at the elbow where drafts usually reveal themselves, and the grout felt warmer than the painted surface. A thin stripe that made me think about voids behind panels. I logged that too. Evidence comes in layers, and the thin ones matter. I set up in the instrument alcove to compare the digital readout with the older analog gauge that sits like a steady elder beside it. The analog needle rested where I expected given the river's mood. The digital showed a value that translated to slightly higher discharge, not a crime, not even an error if the reset had miscalibrated the offset. I cycled the unit through a soft reboot while watching the needle, which shouldn't care about firmware. The reboot came back clean. The digital still sat a little high. I wrote a line in the notebook that would make sense to me tomorrow, and then, on a hunch, tapped the gauge's glass. The needle did not twitch. Good glass, good spring. The ledger the engineer had handed me listed maintenance windows that matched plant activity, but the hour blocks on the summary sheets carried a gap I couldn't reconcile. The reporting software had stitched over it with a straight line, as if the river had taken a breath and held it. I flipped further back, tracing the pattern over several nights. Most lines sang a simple song. One song broke key for a short stretch, and then came back as if it knew it had left the room. I quoted a fragment into my notebook, the way I was taught to handle logs when I don't have a camera on the page. Tailrace reading steady, post-blink normalization applied. Another line from earlier that day, no mechanical irregularities observed. The calm of the language, alongside the crooked picture, ran like a cool finger along my spine. I went below to the drainage gallery, where the dam's private weather lives. Down there, the air is its own instrument. It should be cool and a little damp, with a taste of limestone where the concrete breathes. Tonight, a pocket near the bend carried warmth that did not belong to any pipe or lamp. I held the back of my hand near the wall and felt a breath against the skin. Not a breeze, more like the whisper that rides along a door's edge when a room beyond is under a different mood. I lifted the thermal camera and saw a faint oval on the concrete, a degree or two above its neighbors, and a corresponding smear on the floor, as if a warm shoe had stood and then stepped away without grit. I put the camera away before I read too much into color. Back at the counter, the engineer poured fresh coffee and asked if I wanted some. I took a cup and let the heat stand in my palms. He signed my pass log where a line demanded his name and wrote only his initials. "Paper's messy after the blink," he said again, as if practicing the sentence. I asked about unplanned tests, small gate moves, fish passage trials, anything that might throw the temperature readings a little. He shook his head. Nothing logged. The way he said logged did not mean nothing happened. It meant nothing on the books. Moral pressure works quietly in facilities like this. Keep the grid calm, keep the report clean, keep the neighbors off the phone. On my way out, I paused on the intake deck to listen to the reservoir. The wind had shifted a notch and now came from the gorge, carrying the river's colder breath. I could hear the chain at the security gate tick the rail where a hook doesn't quite sit flush. That sound belongs to gravity and small motions. It's a metronome that helps me measure drift in my own thoughts. Tonight the ticks felt too regular, and then, for one long beat, too slow. I set the flow meter in the water again as a sanity check. Its hum matched the river's steady argument with the dam. When I lifted it, a drop fell back toward the surface and hesitated, held by a strand of something invisible, before it let go and joined the rest. On the guard shack window, where my breath fogged a small patch of glass, someone had taped a copy of the site's public fact sheet. I scanned the paragraph that describes average discharge and seasonal adjustments, and then the line that visitors always read out loud. Safe, efficient, reliable. My sealed notebook felt heavier inside my jacket. I wrote my own line under the last entry. Records disagree politely. Warm pocket in gallery. Cedar where there should be concrete. As I turned to go, the access badge buzzed in my hand. Not the short acceptance chirp, but a longer note, as if it had tried to speak and then thought better of it. I looked back at the door I had just locked and saw the red ready light hold steady. I pressed the badge to the reader again. No buzz. Only the same patient red. The river below kept its voice, the kind that says it will still be here after our paperwork and our blinking lights. I stood a moment longer, listening, and felt the shape of the assignment change. A courtesy audit, they had called it. I could already feel the rest of the story tugging from places where paper doesn't like to go. Morning found me pretending it was just another verification run. I told the scheduler I needed one more look while the plant was ramping, and the answer came back with that polite stiffness that means someone upstream wants this finished quietly. I signed out the same hard hat, checked the access badge against my collar the way habit teaches, and slid the sealed notebook into its pocket where the pages would keep a little warmth. The flow meter rode at my hip, vein freshly cleaned. The thermal camera took the upper slot in the pack so I could reach it with a single motion. When work feels watched, you make movements small and honest. I started with the instruments. First the analog elder, then the digital that had sulked high the night before. I did the ritual aloud, not for the engineer but for the place. Verify range, verify dampening, note needle rest, note readout drift, record qualitative agreement or lack of it. The analog rested where the river's shoulder would put it on a day like this. The digital rose and then gave a lazy sag, not to match the needle, but to settle in a way that felt like a compromise. Reset after a blink can leave a temper in electronics. Even so, the sag had an attitude. I cupped the housing and felt a fine tremble, more like the aftertaste of vibration than the thing itself. I wrote a simple sentence in the notebook and kept the words as plain as a wrench. Analog steady, digital conciliatory. On the intake deck, I set the flow meter in the reservoir again, nose at a known angle, and let the vein find the river's truth. A hum ran up the handle into my palm, clean and regular. I shifted to the lee of a boom log for contrast. There, the sound was thinner than it should have been, like breath pressed through cloth. I traced the log with the back of my knuckles, felt slime-slick wood, and then a patch that was wrong, dry and faintly warm in a place that should hold the night's chill. Cedar came back to me in that instant, the smell riding up from the water where the nose should have only given me algae and cold. Somewhere between intake and tailrace, the place was wearing a borrowed plank. I brought the thermal camera up and took a slow pan across the mouth of the intake. Heat signatures obey size, depth, and flow. They do not play favorites. The same narrow ribbon I had seen downstream appeared here too, shy, hugging concrete as if avoiding conversation. It kept to the margin where no gate should own it. I captured the sweep, then gave the lens a breath to clear and did it again. Same ribbon. A gull lifted from a railing, circled once, and landed on a bollard closer to that warm line than birds choose when they can pick any perch. Animals don't read our logs, but they notice our mistakes. I made another note. Inside, the night engineer had given way to a day tech with a younger face and an older gaze. He slid a clipboard toward me without greeting, the kind of move that says the conversation started before I arrived. "We had another blink," he said, as if talking about a neighbor's porch light. I let the words sit there until it felt less casual. "You on backup power?" He nodded once. "Transfer clean," he said. And a little later, "Mostly clean." That qualifier is where the truth likes to hide. He had a radio at his belt that should have been murmuring plant talk. Instead, it held its breath. When he finally keyed it to check in, the carrier sounded hollow, the way rooms sound when furniture has been taken out fast. I asked for the paper trail. He gave me the same binder and a second stack that looked newer than its cover. The first contained the elegant curves and boxy tables that any auditor admires. The second carried copies of work orders with hand stamps that didn't match the signature block. A fork is not always treachery. Sometimes it is just haste under pressure. I read until the language thinned. One line mentioned temporary barricade installed near Gallery Bend. Another used fewer words. Crate received, contents per manifest. No manifest was attached. The initials on both lines were the same I had seen on my pass log. Polite disagreement in records often wears a single set of letters. I went back down to the drainage gallery because the air there had held a memory. The pocket of warmth near the bend didn't greet me immediately. I walked past it, then turned and walked through again, slower, until the back of my hand found that whisper of air. I pressed the thermal camera against my cheek to steady it and frame the wall. The oval was still there, a shy bruise of heat on concrete. On the floor, the faint smear I had pretended was a shoe grew a tail that drifted toward the corner. Not a footprint, not exactly. More like a place where warmth had chosen the crack between slabs and taken it as a road. I kept the camera down. I didn't want to teach myself a story the evidence hadn't earned. At the corner, a section of paneling had been set back in a hurry. The bolts showed wrench scars that didn't belong to plant maintenance. They were too fresh, sharp against paint that carried old scuffs. Someone had opened the wall and put it back with the kind of care that hopes not to be noticed more than it cares for finish. I felt the seam with a fingertip and found grit packed where gaskets should have lain flush. Cedar again, faint, as if the material beyond had been shipped recently and still remembered its box. I wrote a line in the notebook that would not be pretty to read in a meeting. Panel pulled, reseated without gasket discipline. I checked the phone in the alcove because routine is a shelter when the ground shifts. The handset had weight and a coiled cord that remembered calmer days. When I lifted it, the line opened to a quiet that was not silence. I could hear the faint sea of electricity, the soft grain that means a circuit exists but is listening to the wrong room. I replaced the handset and told myself that later parts of this story, if there were to be any, would have less patience for jokes about phones. For now, I logged it as a small thing, an instrument that pretended to be ready, voice held somewhere else. Back on the tailrace platform, I took a long look at turbulence. Patterns build a kind of muscle in the eye. You don't calculate them, you feel them. Today, the main plume had a heartbeat that belonged to the plant's schedule, but the margin along the far wall carried a skip, a not quite rhyme. I set the flow meter in a slack pocket where I could listen without noise. The handle brought me a hum that rode up the bones of my wrist, and there, under it, the faintest counterbeat, the sort of thing you might think you imagined, unless the river has taught you not to dismiss whispers. I stayed until my hand grew cold, and the metal's chill got in, then stood and let blood wake the skin with pins. The day tech joined me and squinted at the water like it owed him an explanation. "You're looking too hard," he said in a tone that wanted to be friendly and landed on weary. I told him looking hard was the only thing I was paid for. That felt honest. He said the blink had tripped a couple of alarms that cleared themselves, not the kind of thing that makes reports. I asked to see the clears. He rubbed his jaw and said that would need a supervisor. I said the river already was one. Before lunch, I returned to the upstream side and walked the booms. A tug had nudged them last week. The scar was plain where chains met wood, a bruise in steel color. I tracked the line to a buoy that should have sat with an easy posture. It leaned toward the intake instead, as if it had been taught a new habit overnight. In the water below, a slick traced a curve I didn't love. It wasn't oil. It looked like heat made visible by the chill, a shimmer that rides the surface like breath. I touched my glove to it and felt nothing but wet. The eye knows more than the skin when it comes to gradients. By late afternoon, the air had shifted from clean to unsettled. Not storm, just a change in the river's voice as it pressed the back of the dam. I stood under the gatehouse eave and reviewed what I had, a ribbon of warmth where no gate claims it, an analog and a digital that refuse to sing the same note, a panel that has known other hands, a phone that opens its throat to nowhere, paper that politely disagrees with itself. None of this is a ghost. All of it is a pattern if you draw the lines lightly enough and wait. At the guard counter, the clipboard had been replaced by a visitor log that was too empty for a weekday. The initials that had signed my pass now sat in a different shade of ink, as if their owner had been hurried and borrowed whatever pen lay near. I asked for the manifest that the work order had promised. The day tech said it would arrive with the evening courier. His radio, which had been quiet, suddenly offered a fragment like a bird hitting a window, and then pretending it meant to do that. He lowered the volume and said he had to check a gate. I watched him go and noticed the access badge on his belt had a sticker over the photo. That is not plant practice. That is a patch made in a hallway. I waited until he was gone and stood near the door I had opened the night before. The reader light held steady in its patient color. I pressed my badge to it for no good reason and felt the same long buzz travel into my palm. A note held a little too long for acceptance and too short for failure. I removed the badge, waited, and pressed again. This time only the patient light and no sound at all. Outside on the deck, the chain at the security gate ticked once and then did not tick again for longer than gravity should allow. I looked up toward the reservoir and saw a single ripple travel against a stray breeze as if the wind had decided to be helpful and then changed its mind. I wrote in the notebook, careful and spare, and closed it before the words could warm the paper too much. The assignment had been to confirm nothing. The evidence wanted me to confirm something smaller and more expensive, that a place built to keep its own weather had acquired a pocket of summer and a habit of polite mistruths. I slipped the notebook into its pocket, felt the spine settle against my ribs, and headed for the auxiliary corridor where the panels make their little conversations with each other. Whatever lived in those conversations had started to speak in a voice that did not belong to concrete or river. I told myself I would just listen. The door at the end of the hall waited with its ready light steady and its badge reader as blank as a held breath. The records office sat half a flight above the control room, a quiet place with metal shelves that absorbed sound and a printer that moved with the shy confidence of a cat. I signed the visitor line with my initials and waited while the clerk decided whether I was part of his day. I kept the hard hat on because it saves an argument later and because habits make a kind of armor. When he finally looked up, I asked for plant logs for the past stretch, any work orders touching the drainage gallery, manifests for deliveries, and the change history on the digital instruments. He slid a tray toward me with the first two before I finished the list. His hand stayed on the edge of the drawer that held the rest, as if the paper inside needed calming. I opened the sealed notebook and wrote a plain title for the hour, Paper Trail. I kept the words small so the lines would not feel crowded. The first binder carried daily summaries, familiar blocks of script that used the same handful of verbs. The second binder held work orders with stamps that did not match the font on the cover. I read the first work order out loud in a low voice so I couldn't skip ahead. Temporary barricade near Gallery Bend, purpose stated as safety during inspection. No drawing attached, no hazard noted. The initials at the bottom were the same I had seen on my pass. I took a sheet of scrap and copied the letters with my own pen until my hand learned their weight. Then I found them again on a different page with a signature that looked like the same name taught to write in a rush by a different tutor. Same letters, different pulse. A fork rarely announces itself. It shows up as the ghost of a hand. The manifest stack was slimmer than I had hoped. The top sheet admitted a crate received with contents per manifest, but the manifest itself was not in the stack. I asked the clerk for it. He returned with a manila folder that had no label and laid it on the counter without meeting my eye. Inside, a photocopy of a manifest listed crates and pallets that would mean something to a warehouse. The item descriptions were careful without being useful. Hardware, panels, sealants. A line carried a blacked rectangle where a vendor name should live. Heavy ink pressed hard through the page. I lifted the sheet and saw the ink's bite on the paper below. That is not plant practice. That is someone using a marker the way a raincoat uses tar. I asked to see the digital change history and was told that would need someone with the right backroom key. The clerk's tone tried innocence and landed on exhausted. He handed me a slip to fill with my request and slid it toward me in that way that hopes time will tire both of us before the answer arrives. I filled the slip and tucked the carbons into my notebook. When I looked up, he had already turned to the printer to give his back an excuse. I took the binders to a side table and worked through the past week of entries without skimming. The summaries described weather, load, and routine checks. In the middle of a page, a sentence appeared that felt different, as if someone had stepped into a room and left the door ajar. Power blink noted, normalization routine applied, values reconciled to baseline. The words told me nothing the graph had not, but the cadence held a small stagger. On the page for the day after, a line that should have named a visual check of the gallery simply said complete with no initials. Another kind of fork. Returns without a sender. The day tech found me there and stood with his hands in his pockets like a student called to read. I asked about the crate and whether a barricade in the gallery was still in place. He said the crate had been broken down and the trash was out by the loading dock as of early this morning. I asked if he had the manifest. He said it had been taken for scanning. The clerk avoided nodding by leaning further into the printer. I thanked them both and carried the work order binder back to the put-away stack, then hesitated and took one more look at the signatures. The same letters lived in two styles. If I read them as flow, one hand moved with plant patience. The other took the corners fast. On the way to the loading dock, I passed the auxiliary corridor and paused under the same ready light that had watched me the night before. The badge reader kept its steady patience. I pressed the access badge to it and felt nothing but the plastic warming in my palm. I lifted the badge away and a long, faint buzz ran through it a moment later, belated, like a cough covered by a closed door. I stood still and timed my breath against the power hum in the wall. The lag did not match what the plant was doing. I wrote that down. Lag belongs to distance, wrong routing, or something sitting between device and door that wants a say. The trash bay held the scent of wet cardboard and diesel. A stack of broken crate sides leaned in a roll-off bin, cedar bright where nails had torn cleanly. The stencil on one board had been sanded just enough to smudge a company mark without erasing it. I brushed the grain with gloves and felt a patch of warmth that lingered longer than it should in shade. A little heat lives in wood that has been worked, yes, but this had the tone of something that had been near a warm surface and moved away without time to cool. In the residue, a fine dust shone, as if it had known a belt sander in a hurry. I thumbed a small amount into a sample sleeve, more for my own trust than for a lab that would never see it. The sleeve wrote in the notebook, tucked in a page where Cedar already had a line. Back in the gallery, the air held its contrary pocket. I walked through once with empty hands, again with the thermal camera against my cheek, and a third time with eyes closed to feel draft on skin. The warm oval on the wall was no longer oval. It had thinned and spread along a seam, a gentle taper that found the floor crack and chose it again. The smear that had looked like a shoe now resembled something set down carefully and lifted more carefully still. I knelt and touched the concrete with the back of my hand. The warmth was slight, the kind that asks to be ignored. I asked what would happen if I did. I tried the alcove phone again because a right repeated becomes a signal. The line gave me that wrong room hush. And then, for the length of a slow breath, a faraway tapping, as if a chain touched a bar, regular until it wasn't. I said my name and the word copy out of habit, and because speaking into emptiness has saved people before. The hush returned. I replaced the handset and watched the cradle until the small charge icon that should have winked to life decided it had no one to impress. At the tailrace platform, I listened to turbulence until the cold got through. The counterbeat I had felt the day before was more certain now, no longer a ghost, but a guest who had learned the kitchen light. I set the flow meter into a calm patch and felt the handle's hum align with the main flow. Then, under it, the soft insistence of a second pattern. The two did not fight. They shared a room politely. I brought the thermal camera up for a short pan. The ribbon along the far wall still kept to itself, unwilling to touch the broader plume. A cormorant dropped low, skimming the heat line with a wingtip, and then rising sharply as if the air there had lifted and let go without warning. Animals notice. I returned to the records office because I needed the change history and did not trust a slip in a tray to carry my request with proper urgency. The clerk had been replaced by a supervisor whose badge sat level and new. I asked again. He listened without blinking and then stepped into a side room. When he returned, he brought a printout that would have meant more if the times had not all been rounded to friendly intervals. The edits were there, yes, but they read like a bedtime story told to soothe an anxious child. He pointed to a line that said the digital instrument had been recalibrated after the blink and now agreed with baseline. I asked which baseline. He said plant standard with the confidence of someone who has not met the river. I thanked him and kept the paper only long enough to copy a few phrases into the notebook so I would remember the tone as much as the words. On the wall by the door, a map showed public access routes in neat colors. I traced a finger along the spillway road and found the cart path that skirts the switchyard. The scale bar wore neat little boxes that wanted to be counted. I ignored them and used memory instead. If I followed the cart path to the fence line, I could reach the far wall of the tail race from the outside. I asked whether the path was open. The supervisor said it was closed pending maintenance. Pending is a word that likes to live forever. I said I needed to check the margin for debris patterns, and he said he would have to ask. We stood there in the politest of disagreements. Moral pressure entered the room and sat between us like a third chair. I stepped out to the deck to give him time to phone whoever watches these conversations. The river laid its shoulder against concrete with the patience of a working animal. The chain at the gate ticked, then held, then ticked again with a longer pause, an off-tempo that would not bother a tourist but would bother a person who counts by breath. I looked up to the reservoir and saw a tiny seam on the surface where two skins of water met and pretended to be one. Wind moves seams, so do releases, so does heat. When I went back in, the supervisor had an answer that sounded like yes said through a scarf. Access allowed with escort, limited duration, stay within marked limits. He slid a visitor vest across the counter and a fresh badge with a sticker over the photo, the kind of sticker you use when a printer is down or a change came fast. I pressed the badge to the desk with a finger and felt the faintest buzz run through it, delayed, as if a decision had to travel a long hallway before agreeing. I signed the new line in the log and closed my notebook. My notes for the morning looked simple. A hand that writes in two styles, a manifest that hides its source, a crate that came and left warmth where it touched, a panel that had been pulled and put back in a hurry, a phone that listens to another room, a heat ribbon that keeps to the margin, an escort offered with a sticker over a face. None of it was strange if viewed alone. Together it made a map with roads that did not quite join. I clipped the visitor vest closed, checked the flow meter and the thermal camera by touch, and let the access badge hang where the reader would find it quickly. Out beyond the fence, the far wall waited with its quiet warmth and its habit of disagreeing politely. I told myself I would walk the margin and only look. The escort cleared his throat behind me, as if to remind both of us who held the keys, and the ready light over the door paused just for a breath before deciding to turn green. The escort met me at the switchyard gate with a vest that had been folded once too carefully, as if it had done this before, and wanted me to know it remembered. His badge wore a sticker over the face, The sort of patch you put on when printers are sulking or names change without time for ceremony. He kept his hands in his pockets and his voice in the low register of people who don't want to disturb machinery. We walked the cart path along the fence until the ground leaned toward the tailrace, and the air traded the dry bite of dust for the wet breath that lives near moving water. I carried my pack light, flow meter at the ready, and the thermal camera where my fingers could find it without looking. My notebook pressed warm against my chest through the jacket, a steady weight that reminded me I was not here to admire concrete. Outside the fence, the far wall revealed itself as a simple thing complicated by context. To a tourist, it would be only stained concrete and ladders stitched to maintenance landings. To my eyes, the margins held the story. Streaks, vortices, drift lines, the river's own handwriting. I set the flow meter in the slack near the wall and felt the handle take on the main plume's hum. Then, below it, the small counterbeat I had logged on earlier passes made itself known again, patient and unembarrassed. The escort pretended not to notice my attention. His radio gave a bare hiss, as if it too preferred manners. I brought the thermal camera up and let it acclimate as I breathed slow through my nose. The screen showed the world in soft hieroglyphs of heat. The main outflow glowed where it should. Tucked close to the wall ran the same narrow ribbon I had seen from inside, keeping its distance from the larger body, like a shy cousin at a reunion. Above that, at the base of a service bay, a shallow rectangle warmed and cooled in a metered rhythm, not tied to gate cadence so much as to a breathing I could not place. I asked the escort whether a tunnel sat behind that bay. He said that was the old inspection run, mostly sealed, used when there were more bodies on payroll. Mostly sealed is the kind of phrase that makes my shoulders tighten. I'll need a closer look at the landing, I said. He said nothing for a moment, and then told me to stay within painted lines. The lines had been refreshed recently. The paint smelled faintly sweet under the river's damp. Someone had made sure they were easy to see, as if a clear rule would do the work of a good reason. Up on the landing, the concrete felt warmer than the air, a softness under my boots that had nothing to do with texture and everything to do with stored day. I laid the back of my hand against the wall and felt a memory of heat that did not belong to the sun. I lifted the thermal camera. The rectangle sharpened, bright along one edge where a seam met a panel. A line of bolts held everything together with a confidence I didn't trust. Their heads wore wrench scars as fresh as the ones I'd found below in the gallery. Cedar came up again, faint, like a word you hear across a room, and choose not to shout back. The escort leaned on the rail and studied a gull long enough for me to know he was not there by accident. There was a phone on the landing, the old kind with a door, the kind you open when noise makes you doubt your own voice. I swung it out on its hinge. The handset sat in its cradle like an animal at rest. I lifted it and found that same wrong room hush I had heard beneath. Only this time, a floorboard creaked somewhere along the line, a short sound not made by wind or static. "Control tailrace landing check," I said softly, knowing no one would answer and saying it anyway. After a long moment, the hush thickened, as if fabric had been laid over a table. I set the handset back. The charge light failed to pretend. "Short test," I told the escort, holding up the thermal camera. He made a non-committal sound and fell a step back, granting space the way people do when they want distance without looking like they do. I swept the wall again. Heat pooled along the seam, drained slowly at the base, and then, this was new, traveled in a thin line toward a deck drain with a grate that had been brushed clean too recently to be explained by pride. Water scours, heat traces, people clean with purpose. The line made a right turn a little too neat for runoff and disappeared where metal met shadow. I crouched and studied the grate. A single strand of something dark clung to one bar and lay half on the lip, half in the void. It wasn't hair and it wasn't moss. When I touched it with a glove, it behaved like fiber that had carried load and been cut without fraying. Warmth lived in the metal briefly and then confessed it had none of its own. I slipped the strand into a sample sleeve and wrote nothing about it. Some notes you keep off paper until you know what you mean by them. "Path's ending," the escort said, not looking at me. His radio gave the one-syllable sigh that systems make when a channel opens and closes without speech. I told him I wanted to see the door at the service bay. He said that would be beyond our limit. I said I had an order that asked me to confirm nothing in specific, everything in general. He watched the water for an interval and then said the word later, as if it were a password from a different job. We stood there, with the painted line at our toes. Moral pressure took the empty chair again. We retreated to the cart path and circled back toward the auxiliary corridor. Inside the fence, the usual scents sharpened: oil, wet dust, the old iron tang that clings to ladders. I asked the escort whether he had worked here long. He said long enough to know that the plant likes habits and that I was not one. He smiled a little without showing teeth. I let the comment pass. At the corridor door, the ready light ought to have gone green at our approach. It held steady instead, as if uncertain. The badge reader accepted his stickered pass, then demanded mine, then, after a beat that took one breath too many, allowed the latch to fall. Inside, the air changed. The corridor had always kept a cool tongue of air, its own slow river. Now a layer of warmth lay along the floor like a shallow fog without moisture. My shins felt it first, then the delicate skin at the back of the knees. The warming was not dramatic. It was undeniable. The escort noticed because his hand drifted toward his belt as if reach mattered. "Heating issue," he said, an answer rehearsed for a question I had not yet asked. I shook my head once. Concrete does not make weather out of boredom. We walked until the band bent toward the gallery leg where I had felt the pocket days earlier. I could find the corner blindfolded now. The thermal camera showed the wall brightening at the same seam that had caught my attention before, but the oval had flattened further, as if pressure behind it had learned patience. On the floor, the smear was a trail now, slender and quiet, running to the corner where someone had worried at fasteners with a wrench that had left neat bites. The escort watched me watch the panel. He knew what we both knew. Stewardship frowns when panels move without paperwork. I put my palm near the seam and felt the exhale, not air rushing, not even moving with conviction. A steady leaking of warmth, the way a cellar releases summer at twilight. I said, "What's behind this?" He said, "Old inspection run, mostly sealed." The repetition earned him a mark in my mind. "Sealed with what?" I asked. He said the word foam too fast and corrected it to block once the polite answer caught up. Cedar rose again under the words like a note tucked under a door. I opened the sealed notebook and wrote a plain sentence. Warm draft through panel at gallery corner, seam, bright on thermal, floor trail thin toward drain. I kept the language calm and the lines short. Then I closed the book and, without looking at the escort, crouched and held the flow meter sideways near the seam. The vein isn't meant for air, but it will confess to a moving layer if you give it a chance. The blade trembled and found a she rhythm, a whisper of motion that kept time with the breathing rectangle I'd seen outside. The escort made a sound that might have been a sigh or a warning. I let the meter rest and stood. "We'll need to open this with the right people," I said. He nodded in the way that means someone else will decide. I touched a bolt with my glove. It answered with gentle warmth, not enough to sting. Enough to prove company had stood here lately, with tools that remembered hands. The cedar scent walked across the draft, as if carried on a pocket of its own weather. For a moment, my body remembered field days upstate, when temporary cofferdams came in on trucks and left slats and smells behind. I pictured a crate labeled with words that had been sanded down to hint, not tell. Back at the alcove phone, I lifted the handset again. The line gave the same soft grain. And then, a click far away, the shape of a voice without the voice itself. A long breath later, the faintest tap, metal on metal, the way a chain touches a bar when wind changes its mind. I said my name and the word copy again. A ritual to keep the room honest. The hush closed over the click like silt over a footprint. We moved toward the service bay. The escort spoke first, quiet. "If we go in there, we do it on a list with witnesses." I said that suited me if the list had real names and the witnesses had badges without stickers. He didn't answer. At the door, the ready light paused as if deciding between courtesy and caution, then shifted and allowed the latch to drop. Inside, the air was warmer by a shade you feel on eyelids. The room had been tidied with a speed that leaves geometries out of square by a finger's width. A pallet jack idled in a corner with its tongue raised, ready to slip under weight. On a workbench lay a roll of gasket that did not match plant stock, a color off by a small, stubborn degree. I lifted the thermal camera and panned the floor. A trail of slightly brighter footprints, or the absence of chill in those shapes, moved from the bench to a panel on the far wall, then stopped at a line of tape that told a story. Do not process beyond this point. The tape had been lifted and set down again by a hand that believed in neatness as apology. I let the camera fall and listened. The hum of plant life was present but damped. As if something absorbed it, my skin prickled at the edge near the collar, where warm air and cool jacket meet. I opened the sealed notebook because doing so steadied my hands. "Time," the escort said softly. His radio gave a half syllable. In the hall behind us, the ready light over the door held steady. Then, without the usual blink of command from the reader, it softened to a color I had not seen on that fixture. I knew what the nearest map would say if I looked. Inspection run mostly sealed, not for routine access. I didn't look. The warm draft in the gallery had taught me its path. The ribbon along the far wall had kept its shy line. The records disagreed with courtesy. The phone listened to a room we were not in. I set the flow meter on the bench, slid the thermal camera into its pouch, and pulled the hard hat down so the strap met the nape of my neck, the way it does when you expect movement. The sealed notebook went back to its pocket where the paper would stay warm. I told the escort I would file for the opening with proper form. He said he would walk me out. We stood a long breath together, letting the plant's hum find us again. Then, from the panel on the far wall, the faintest exhale came, warm and regular as a sleeping thing. The ready light over the bay door gave a patient blink that did not belong to any badge I held. I asked for the phone room because when instruments disagree, I start with the thing that carries voices. The escort didn't argue. He only adjusted his vest as if a layer sat wrong and led me out of the bay, past the pallet jack and the neat apology of tape, into the corridor that sloped toward the switchboard. The ready lights along the way behaved themselves until we reached the bend, where the gallery's warm draft lives. There, the first lens hesitated before it chose a color, and the door accepted our badges as if it were indulging us rather than answering. Inside the phone room, the air felt drier, treated with the careful blandness that helps electronics last. Racks of equipment murmured at a steady pitch, fans serving their quiet purpose. I hung the hard hat on a hook and stood with my palms on the counter to still the habit of touching every panel. Old training says you look first, listen second, only then reach. The patch field held a brace of jumper wires and patterns that made sense for recent changes. One card flashed a code that belongs to routine work, but it did it with a confidence that read like performance. A spool of spare cable sat open on a stool as if someone had taken a call mid-trim and never returned. The escort lingered by the door with his radio low, voice button covered by a thumb that did not quite rest. I picked up a test handset from the wall, the kind with a clip and a bite mark, where a nervous tech once worried it through a long outage. I clicked it onto a line that should have served the tailrace landing. The sound came up thin, not the healthy hush of a live circuit, but the memorized quiet you get when a loop is open and the system simulates kindness. I switched to the gallery alcove line. Same practiced silence. I reached for a random office extension. That one came alive with the soft moss of a healthy pear and the low chatter of a fax machine somewhere rehearsing boredom. I wrote a sentence in the sealed notebook, small and neat. Plant voice lands clean. Field voice lands elsewhere. The supervisor joined us with a smile meant for auditors. He asked if we were comfortable, if we had what we needed, if we would be long. I showed him the test handset and asked about the recent blinks. He gave me the party line. Transfer clean, alarm self-cleared, instruments reconciled to baseline. I asked which baseline, and he told me plant standard without pause. When I asked about field circuits that don't return a dial tone, he said they had scheduled maintenance, and that closures were in place for safety. I said I had been on the landing phone an hour earlier, and closures had not existed then. He looked down at his new badge with its sticker, and the smile quieted. I asked if we could look at the recordings on the logging system, the one that takes a polite snapshot of alert traffic and phone events during irregularities. He produced a key with the weight of a privilege you lend only in company, unlocked a small cabinet, and slid a drawer that held a drive with a label scribbled over an older label. A thin hairline crack showed in the plastic. Too fine to matter, too precise to be accidental. He removed the drive and set it on the counter, with a care that did not hide the fact that it had been in and out lately. He powered the console. The monitor woke in a palette older than the rest of the room, and offered a menu with names that matched my request. We watched the list populate. It did so politely, then stopped a little too soon. "There's a gap," I said, in the tone you use when naming weather. The supervisor said a service hollow sometimes appears during backup. He did not meet my eyes. I scrolled the log to the hour when the landing phone had offered me the wrong room. The system showed no call, no off-hook event, no hiss of life. It showed a wellness time at a neat, friendly moment, a housekeeping line cleaning its own footprints. I copied phrases into my notebook without comment. The escort watched the door, which watched us back with its patient light. The smell of cedar found me in a room that should not know it. It came faint, almost polite, as if a box had stood here a while and left its accent behind. I followed the scent to a corner where a coil of gasket sat beside a stack of junction covers. The gasket color was off by a stubborn degree from the plant's stock, a tone I had already learned by sight. I lifted the coil a finger's breadth and set it down again. Warmth had lingered beneath it, small and honest. Someone had made repairs and cleaned up without lying about the speed. I asked for the instrument change history again, not the summary print, but the detail that shows who touched what and when. The supervisor opened a second cabinet and slid a paper roll across the counter with the sigh of a person who had been arguing on 2 channels and keeping the arguments from meeting. The roll listed edits with tidy stamps that made the minutes look like a well-behaved parade. I saw the recalibration event after the blink. I saw the line that claimed agreement with baseline. I did not see the part where anyone had verified the old analog against the digital after heat started to behave like a guest along the wall. I wrote that absence down as if it were present. The escort's radio offered a brief burst, then swallowed itself. He tapped the volume and raised it enough to let the hiss breathe. From within the noise came a tap, metal on metal, with the posture of the chain at the gate. The sound was too small to belong to this room, too deliberate to be a loose screw. The supervisor pretended not to hear. I asked where the phone terminations for the old inspection run lived. He said they had been retired. I asked if retired meant dead. He said it meant not in use. We stood in the polite grammar of people choosing their words. When you can't trust a room, you change rooms. I asked the escort to take me back to the gallery. He did so without comment. The corridor's warmth lay thinner now, as if the draft had lost interest or settled deeper. I could feel it brush my shins like the memory of bathwater. At the corner panel, I held my hand near the seam again. The exhale was present, steady, and unashamed. I brought out the flow meter and let the vein learn the little breath. It found it quicker this time, a rhythm that matched the shy rectangle I had seen on the thermal outside. I took the camera out and framed the seam. The bright line had narrowed and lengthened, a patient migration toward a floor drain scoured cleaner than its neighbors. The alcove phone waited in its old metal cradle. I opened the door and lifted the handset. The same wrong room hush returned, followed by the smallest sound, like a fingertip brushing fabric near a microphone. Control, gallery alcove check, I said, because a ritual can hold the shape of a conversation even when the other party refuses to join. Far inside the line, something clicked. A relay not wired to this wall. I said copy and waited. The hush thickened and let a low breath through that did not belong to any person I have known on a plant radio. I replaced the handset gently so the cradle switch would not be spared the signal of TourTact. The charge light stayed dark. I told the escort I wanted to try a portable on plant maintenance channel. He handed me his radio without hesitating, which told me he wanted me to hear what he had been hearing. I keyed the mic and announced a test from the gallery bend. The carrier took my voice and sent it down the hall, with less echo than the geometry allowed, as if something softened the sound around the corner. A reply came back from a tech upstairs, casual, clear, ordinary. "Good copy," he said. "Anything needed?" I said negative and thanked him. When I clipped to the radio back, the escort looked relieved, as if ordinary contact proved the room still belonged to people. It did not persuade me. Systems can succeed while a small truth slides past them in a seam. We walked to the tailrace landing to try that phone again. I opened its door and lifted the handset. This time the hush carried a new layer. The faintest regular beat, not dial tone, not motor, not gate cadence. It sounded like breathing translated into an instrument too old for the job. I said the single word test and waited. The beat paused, then resumed at a slightly different interval, like a person choosing not to mimic a rhythm, but unable to resist measuring it. I asked the supervisor to listen. He declined with a pleasant line about other calls. The escort listened and said only, "That's not plant." I put the handset back and wiped my palm on my jacket without thinking. At the landing rail, I studied the water. The main plume kept its faithful push. Along the wall, the shy ribbon moved with the steadiness of a person keeping a promise to the edge of a room. I brought the thermal camera up and watched the rectangle at the base of the service bay glow and ease, glow and ease. A simple cycle that had learned patience. Heat was traveling a route that our drawings had promised to block. Paper had said sealed. The concrete beneath my hand said otherwise. My job was not to name the thing you cannot see, but to trace what it does to the instruments built to ignore it. We returned to the control counter. The supervisor had found the manifest I had asked for and set it under a paperweight that looked like a river stone. The vendor name was still blacked with earnest ink. The list of contents stayed careful and unhelpful. I tapped the line that mentioned panels and asked where they had gone. He said into storage. I asked where. He gestured toward a door I had already been denied. I thanked him and took a copy of the page, which he granted with the air of a man handing over a menu that lists what you cannot have. The clerk came in with a small envelope and placed it beside my pass log. It held a sticker with my face, the kind used when a printer sulks. He asked me to apply it over the photo on my badge. I held the plastic in my hand and felt it offer that belated buzz again, the one that arrives after the decision is made somewhere else. I affixed the sticker because refusing would dramatize a fact already obvious. I was inside a process that preferred its own reflection to a clear river. I closed the sealed notebook over the morning's words and felt the warm paper firm against my ribs. What I had was plain and not small. Phones opening to the wrong room, warmth taking seams for roads, a ribbon of heat keeping to the far wall, work orders with 2 hands and 1 name, a badge reader that thinks before it chooses, a supervisor polite enough to be careful. None of it named a thing. All of it shaped a question that grew heavier when I tried to set it down. I told the escort I would file for the panel opening by the gallery bend with signatures, witnesses, and a room full of people who pretend they love daylight. He said he would walk the request in himself. He meant he would also walk it past places where requests go to rest. We shook hands like colleagues who will share a silence for the length of an investigation. As we turned to go, the alcove phone gave a short, soft sound, the kind you hear when a handset is lifted very gently and set down without wanting the cradle to notice. The ready light over the door watched us with its patient color, and somewhere between wall and wire, a warm breath measured our leaving. Archives live where light is careful. I asked for the drawing vault and was told by the supervisor that a records specialist would meet me there. The escort kept his hands in his vest and watched the hall, as if the walls had learned to move a little when no one looked. I wore the hard hat out of habit, and because the brim is a place to put your thoughts when a room wants them. My access badge gave its belated buzz at the vault door, the same held note that says a decision took a longer walk than it admits. Inside, the air was drier than the phone room and warmer by a shade that paper likes against the skin. The specialist arrived with a key ring that looked inherited and a face that had practiced saying yes while meaning maybe. I gave her the list. Civil sheets for the drainage gallery, as-builts for the inspection run on the tailrace side, revision logs after the recent blink, and any red lines tied to barricades or temporary closures. She moved with quiet economy, pulling drawers that rolled like well-fed cats. The sets came in tidy rolls with tags whose ink had known many hands. I set my sealed notebook on the table to weight the corners and ease the drawings flat, breathing slow so my breath would not wave the vellum. Ritual first, title block, scale, revision cloud, initialing hand. The sheet said the right names, the right project, the right mile of river. The revision clouds told of small moves across seasons, guardrail, lighting, a ladder shifted for reach. I traced the gallery leg with a fingertip and found the corner where the warm seam lives. The panel line existed on paper as a plain joint, gasketed, anchored, nothing to trouble a day. I flipped to the cross sections and looked to see where the inspection run met the tailrace wall. The detail marker sent me to a page that was not in the roll. I asked for the tailrace subset. The specialist brought a new roll and a polite apology. On the new sheet, the detail showed a closure at the bay I had stood beneath, a block poured and sealed after an older era that had loved more bodies on payroll. The hatch noted non-routine access only, with a call-out to a plate that carried a stock number I did not see in the plant's current list. The seam was called cold joint, not a phrase you waste on romance. Another sheet carried a field note in a hand that ran uphill when it was tired. Run sealed to spec. Phone lines retired in place. I read it twice. Retired in place rarely means routed clear. It means a path left between rooms so a voice can find it if a person tries hard enough. I asked for the changelog that tracks which sheets were swapped, when, and why. The specialist brought a ledger that smelled like old glue and resolved arguments. I ran a finger down the columns until the dates lined up with the work order that had mentioned a barricade at the gallery bend. The entry was short and tidy. Temporary barricade, no drawing impact. I looked up and let the room sit with that. A barricade that does not exist on paper is the kind that lives to be forgotten. I copied lines into the sealed notebook. The pen moved steady. The paper took the words as if it had waited. A small wrong revealed itself the way small wrongs do. Not shouting, only failing to fit. Two adjacent sheets claim the same index in a way that only happens when someone swaps a drawing at speed and hopes no one notices the pulse. The title blocks agreed on location and cast a healthy shadow of certainty across the page. But one cross-section showed a conduit that the other refused to admit, and the conduit sat exactly where the seam had been warm under my hand. I held both pages in a single grip and lifted them to the light. The watermark ran true. The fonts played nice. The initials in the revision clouds belonged to different seasons. The mismatch lived at the seam between versions, not in the guts of a single lie. That is how polite disagreement works on paper. Everyone is right if the room is small enough. I asked whether the plant kept blueprints older than the rollout to the current standards. The specialist nodded and brought a flat file that looked like it had been moved reluctantly. She slid a set across the table, the era when lines were thicker, when lettering carried a human tremor. On those sheets the inspection run continued past the bay, hugging the wall with modesty, then bowed behind the gallery corner and found the same line I had felt with the thermal, a narrow relief, meant for air, not traffic, given the dignity of a label that said vent. The vent had been called redundant by a later hand and marked for closure. Closure is a promise that should age well. On the wall last night, the promise had a draft. The escort leaned closer, as if a new map could change a hallway. "Sealed, right?" he asked, looking at the old vent line like a person reads an obituary for a man who still buys coffee. I said sealed on paper. He did not smile. I kept turning sheets, following stamps and red lines, until I found a sketch that wasn't a formal drawing at all, but a field note in graphite, the kind left by crews when rain chases them under a roof. The note placed a crate staging inside the bay, and a call-out for gasket stock that did not match plant inventory. The initials on the bottom corner rhymed with the ones on my pass. 2 hands, 1 name. I did not trust myself to read the notes out loud. I asked for the binder that holds deviations, those little memos that plant life writes when field meets plan and decides to compromise. The specialist brought it without comment. Inside, a slip described a phone reroute during temporary works in the tailrace bay. The language had the easy confidence of a person who believes the change will be brief. Landing phone placed on through pair for duration. No return slip lived beside it. I wrote that down as absence again. Absent returns tell loud stories if you let them. The supervisor entered with a careful smile and offered coffee the color of varnish. I declined and asked him to look at the twin title blocks that had claimed the same index. He considered them a respectful moment and then said the magic phrase that soils rooms: legacy document management. It covers a multitude of small sins. I asked if he would sign a request to open the gallery panel under witness. He said he would walk it to the right desk after shift. I glanced at my access badge. It offered a patient silence for once, as if resting after too much thinking. We took the drawings to the gallery, because paper matters more when held against concrete. The corridor had cooled a little, but the seam corner still breathed, a shallow exhale that found the back of my hand with the patience of a house that remembers firewood. I laid the old sheet against the wall and matched a bolt pattern to a circle of scuffs. It fit well enough to make me unhappy. The thermal camera showed the bright line along the joint thinner now, stretched toward a floor drain that had grown cleaner by a shade. Heat was taking the same route Wooder takes when allowed to choose. I tried the alcove phone again. The wrong room hush came up, and then a soft click that wasn't a person choosing to answer, but something recognizing a ritual and deciding it should play along. "Control, gallery, Ben check," I said, knowing the system would record nothing. From a long way off, the shape of a breath paused as if to listen, then resumed. No voice, no tone, only an agreement about rhythm. I set the handset back and watched the cradle switch fail to blink. The escort's radio tried to offer a status and swallowed it. "Open it," I said, quiet, knowing how that sounds when you have not collected every signature a place like this demands. The escort shook his head once. I said, "Then show me a room with someone who can say yes all the way." He said he could show me a room with someone who would talk around yes long enough to make the hour go away. I thought about the ribbon of heat along the far wall, the way it had kept to the margin with such manners. I thought about the crate slats in the roll-off bin, Cedar still warm in shade. I thought about the sticker over the supervisor's face, and the way my badge delayed its buzz like a throat clearing before a lie. We went back through the service bay. The pallet jack had been moved by a hand that believed in tidiness, but not in the truth of memory. Its tracks were fresh, the wet concrete beneath a shade lighter, where weight had kept the surface from breathing. On the bench, the coil of wrong color gasket had lost a coil, diameter slightly smaller, inner face warmer, where it had hugged a flange recently. I set the flow meter on the table out of spite at my own hands, which wanted to reach for wrenches. The thermal camera sat ready and warm against my palm. At the landing, the river offered the sound I needed to think. The main plume kept its oath. Along the wall, the shy line of warmth behaved like a person taught to dance by counting under breath. Close, hold, close, hold. I timed my breathing to it, not to make poetry out of concrete, but to hear the part where the countersong skips. It did, faint, as if the cadence had learned to hitch from the phone room's hush. Patterns travel along the paths we leave for them. Back at the control counter, the supervisor had a form waiting, already started, a marvel of prophylactic language. It granted an opening under controlled conditions, witnesses present, limited duration, instruments monitored, nothing named that would invite a memo with personality. He asked for my initials. I gave them. He asked for an hour. I asked for now. He said later in that scarf-muffled tone that had become a habit. We looked at one another with the civility that wears people thin. I set my sealed notebook on the desk and turned it so he could read the top line from the hour before. Drawings disagree at seam, vent marked redundant on older set, phone reroute lacks return, tailrace ribbons steady along wall. He read and set the form between us like a placemat. We took the long hall back to the gallery to wait for the hour to make up its mind. The ready lights along the way behaved, almost as if someone had adjusted their manners. At the corner, the seam exhaled its careful warmth, and the drain wore its scrubbed circle like fresh chalk. I put my palm near the joint and felt the faintest syncopation, a breath holding and releasing in a rhythm that belonged to the rectangle I had watched at the bay. The escort stood beside me, silent, radio cupped like a bird that might want to fly if the window opened. He said without looking, "You hear it." I said I did. Then the panel itself answered, not a movement you could sell to a camera, not a hinge giving up its restraint. Only the gentlest settling sound, as if bolts had realized their threads were wrong by a hair and were teaching themselves the right pitch. The ready light over the nearby door blinked once in a color I had not seen on that lens, a quiet acknowledgement not meant for my badge. The alcove phone gave a whisper of breath that did not belong to power, and the chain at the distant gate ticked late, as if gravity had been asked to wait its turn. The seam's warmth rose a little in the space between words. I pulled the hard hat down, lifted the thermal camera, and set the flow meter on its side to feel air. The vein found a small, steady rhythm. The drawings on my arm said sealed. The wall said otherwise, in a voice that had learned our rooms. They gave me the hour they had promised they would not give. The escort met me at the gallery bend with a small roll cart that carried a torque wrench, a pallet of approved gaskets, and a bin of tags that say who touched what and when. The supervisor arrived a few breaths later with a witness vest and a manner that asked the room to behave while it was being watched. A maintenance tech I had not met stood back with folded arms, eyes on the ready light, as if it could teach him patience. I set my hard hat and tightened the strap until it remembered my head. The sealed notebook rode in his pocket, warm against the rib, and the access badge hung in the place where it could be found without thought. The flow meter lay on the workbench within reach, its vein clean to a shy shine. The thermal camera woke in my palm and learned the room. We did it by the book, because the book keeps people honest when rooms will not. I spoke the panel number out loud. The supervisor repeated it. The tech read from a sheet that looked new enough to smell like ink. Witnesses present, area cleared, phone checked. I lifted the alcove handset and found the same wrong room hush. I said copy and called my name into it. The hush held, then offered the faintest brush of fabric near a microphone, and the regular breath that had learned how to make a dial tone sound like a memory. I replaced the handset so the cradle would not be spared its small work and logged the failure on the tag. The supervisor initialed it with care. The letters learned their corners as his pen turned them. The tech tested each bolt with a light pull and called out resistance that would satisfy a person who had never seen cedar slats in a roll-off bin. The wrench took the first fastener with a clean ease that did not match its age. We tagged it and placed it on a towel as if heat could stain concrete. The seam gave a breath when the second bolt loosened, warm enough to name and steady as a sleeping thing. The ready light over the service door paused between manners like a person reconsidering a word. The chain at the distant gate ticked late and then tried to catch up. The supervisor watched my notebook like a man watching an opened umbrella in a small room. At the third bolt, the wrench slipped a fraction and then found purchase that felt personal, as if someone had taught the threads a new opinion yesterday. Cedar drifted through the draft, faint and stubborn. The memory of a crate pressed into a form it had not chosen. I brought the thermal camera to my cheek and framed the seam. The bright line had thinned into something taut and deliberate, running toward the scoured drain with the patience of a trickle that trusts a map. I lowered the camera and let my free hand settle near the joint. Warmth found the back of it with the same rhythm I had watched at the tailrace bay. Ease, hold, hold. The tech looked at me without lifting his chin. "Still want this open?" he asked without irony. I said yes with less heat than the wall held. We cracked the last of the fasteners in a sequence that would read well if anyone came to ask after. The panel settled a finger's width, enough to change how the corridor carried sound. The alcove handset, still in its door, gave a breath that did not belong to power, and then resisted the impulse to be obvious. The supervisor started to step forward and stopped himself. The escort shifted his weight so his radio would sit right if he had to run. I slid the flow meter on its side so the vane faced the gap. It trembled, then learned a small, steady motion, more certain than at any time since I had first set it against air. The vane's whisper climbed the handle and settled in the bones at the base of my thumb. I wrote a short line. Draft carries a pulse tied to the bay, flow sufficient to turn a blade built for water. We lifted the panel together. The seam exhaled in a tone you do not hear so much as feel through cartilage. Behind the joint, a narrow passage declared itself in the careful geometry of plant work. Clean, gouged where tools leave pride on metal, and warmer along one side than along the other. Old paint met new gasket in an argument about color no one intended to have. The corridor that should have been sealed let go of the story it had been holding, not in a rush, only with the composure of a person who will not be hurried. I brought the thermal camera up and saw the world behind in the familiar hieroglyphs. One wall bright, the other steady, a floor strip that had learned a path toward a drain. The camera's palette turned the breath into readable weather. The tech set chocks tied a tag that announced the opening with letters loud enough for a hallway and waited for an instruction that would keep him from leaving. The supervisor recited the step where we call control to report the status of the open panel. I lifted the alcove phone again. The hush met me like a neighbor I do not love. "Open at Gallery Bend," I said. "Witnessed, monitoring." From a place that would not be mapped on any plant drawing came the gentlest click, as of a relay choosing, and then the regular breath disguised with confidence as line noise. The word copy did not arrive. The line carried the shape of an answer anyway. We stood at the mouth of the passage and let our bodies learn its weather. My shins felt the warmth first, then the soft cool that lives a handbreadth above floor where air does not always mix. The smell held cedar and the unskilled sweetness of a sealant not on plant list. Under it lived the stony wet you expect when concrete remembers its river. The escort's radio took a call and gave it back in a tone as thin as tissue. The ready light over the service door shifted to a shade I had not been taught in any room. The supervisor set a hand on the frame to claim the moment for paper and said that we would proceed one body length, then stop and reassess. I agreed and left my agreement on the page where it would weigh the same tomorrow. Inside, the proportions did something time does in small spaces when drawings and rooms argue. The first stretch was exactly as long as the sheet promised. The second felt longer by the duration of a held breath. We placed tags where a person could find them without a map, because plant practice is a mercy to the next shift. The warm strip ran along the wall to my right, comforting if comfort is what you call a certainty that does not ask you to approve it. I raised the thermal camera and watched the brightness breathe. The breath set its own pace and then shifted, just a little, not in response to us or to the plant's rumble, but to the chain's reluctant tick-out by the gate. The small sound carried through concrete, as if metal had learned to speak the same vowel. We reached the point where the old drawings had called a vent. The closure detail on the newer set said poured and sealed. The passage ended at a panel that looked poured and sealed until you set a glove against it and discovered a kindness. It was warm enough to be honest, and the gasket under its lip matched the wrong color coil from the bay by a shade that made brothers out of cousins. The tech crouched and put a wrench to an inspection plug that did not love him. It gave. A draft came, not forceful, only steady, carrying the patient smell of wood that has forgotten a forest and learned a room. "Back out and call it," the supervisor said, a tone that had decided how reports would read. I said we would back out after one test and stated it into the sealed notebook like a promise to a future hearing. I set the flow meter flush to the plug's mouth. The vane turned with the exact rhythm I had felt on the tailrace landing when the old phone pretended a dial tone as a favor. I held the meter there long enough to know I was not learning a story I wanted, instead of the one the room was telling. Then I pulled back and stood in the passage breathing with the plant, until my breath was not the loudest thing I owned. The way back felt shorter, which made me trust none of it. We set the panel, snugged each bolt with the same torque we had used to open, and tied tags that would make midnight honest when morning forgot. The ready light found its patient color after thinking about it. The alcove phone refused both of us in equal measure. On the landing above, the river kept its oath. Along the tailrace wall, the shy ribbon held its distance and its manners. Back at the counter, the supervisor wrote a paragraph that would keep committees fed. He used the right verbs and left room for mercy. He promised follow-up work with diagrams that would set nerves at ease without naming the reasons nerves had learned to be useful. I signed where my initials were invited and kept the sealed notebook under my palm. The escort stood a little apart, as if letting a friend choose a door. On a shelf behind the clerk, a new box of visitor vests sat open, Cedar faint as a paper cut. The manifest copy on the desk still wore its black name like a bandage that had decided to be jewelry. I walked to the tailrace one more time because water tells the truth if you ask it well. I watched the main plume keep the easy muscle of a thing that has reasons. I watched the ribbon hold to the margin, shy and firm, as if a rule had been written into a room by use, not ink. I lifted the thermal camera and saw the rectangle at the bay breathe with the steadiness of a sleeper who knows the house and does not plan to wake. The chain at the gate ticked once with the old confidence, and then, again, late, as if it had been asked to be polite. On my way out, the guard shack window held a fresh fact sheet with nothing to say about vents or retired lines placed on through pairs or gaskets that do not match. My access badge buzzed in my palm with that delayed note I had come to recognize. I clipped it to its loop and let it hang. The sealed notebook carried a last line I had written before I reached the door. Passage warm and patient behind the bend. Air carries a measured breath. Phones listen to the wrong room. River agrees by reluctance. I tore the line back out of the page with my eye and made myself leave it in. At the threshold, the phone in the alcove lifted itself by a finger's width and settled as if a hand had changed its mind without wanting the cradle to notice. The ready light over the corridor softened to a color no chart owns. Down in the tailrace, the ribbon along the wall brightened on the camera, one shade, then another, then held, as if waiting to see who would speak first. I thought of the river's patience outliving our signatures. I thought of the seam's breath learning our rooms. I stepped outside and the chain at the gate ticked late, then stopped long enough to make a silence you could carry in both hands.